on that initial night that they did strike. We know right now the president, per his public schedule, is meeting with his national security team in the Oval Office. We have watched members of his national security team, including the director of national intelligence, Tulsi, as we anticipate more from the White House and this administration on their reaction and next possible steps, as the president has warned.
And I want to bring in our chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce. Mary, you were actually at this very base just over a month ago when President Trump went to visit. This is a critical base for several U.S. operations in the past and expected to be in the future. What do you make of this, Iran now announcing that they're attacking it?
And it is the largest U.S. airbase in the region, obviously positioned critically. And the president was there just a few weeks ago on May 15th. I was there. This was during his first big foreign trip, his first trip in the Middle East as well. And at the time, it was interesting, the president speaking to thousands of U.S. troops there. And at the time, he said that it was his priority to end conflicts, not start them. But he added in those remarks that he will not hesitate to wield American power if it is necessary. The president at the time saying, when we are threatened, America's military will answer our enemies without even thinking about it, overwhelming strength and devastating force. That was the quote from the president during that speech. And it gets to this question of what comes next. We know that the president, as Rachel was just saying, has cautioned and warned Iran that if they don't reach peace on his terms, that the U.S. will respond in kind with that same kind of skill, precision, and force that he warned about in that speech over the weekend. I think obviously it was expected that Iran would respond in some way. Certainly that is what the Ayatollah has been telegraphing. Now it appears they are doing just that. The big question, how will the U.S. Then respond, given the kind of rhetoric and language that we have heard from the president? Certainly this is going to be what the president is discussing this afternoon with his national security team.
And we are, a U.S. official is now confirming to ABC News that Iran has, in fact, fired missiles at Qatar. I do want to try to bring up that video again that we're seeing from inside Doha. It looks like you can see those missiles coming in through the night sky there. This, again, is the largest military base in the Middle East, also has played a critical role in several conflicts. This is the video from inside Doha. Again, it looks like you can see those missiles coming in targeted at the largest U.S. air base in the Middle East. I want to bring in Ann Flaherty for a little bit more on the logistics here. And what does it mean to have an attack on this base?
Yeah, so we were just getting word moments ago that a U.S. official does confirm that, in fact, Iran has fired missiles at Qatar, believed to be targeting that Al Udeid Air Force base that we have mentioned. That is the center of the air operations for U.S. Central Command. It's a very critical base. About 10,000 troops are believed to be stationed there. U.S. officials also tell us that, look, you know, they are prepared for this. They knew that this was a risk when President Trump had ordered that attack on Iran's nuclear sites. So they had moved equipment, assets into the region precisely for this scenario. So they are expecting this to some degree. They will say that there are, air defenses that Qatar has. It is able to protect itself in that airspace. But a lot of concern in this building right now about U.S. troops being targeted in this attack.
And U.S. troops around the Middle East are now being told to shelter in place. Our James Longman is in Iraq. And James, what are you seeing and hearing there? And what does this mean for troops in the region in general?
Yeah, look, it's a big moment, Diane. Everyone here knew that something was coming, and I think perhaps there was a sense that there'd be a few days, perhaps that maybe the Iranians would sort of think about what they were going to target, that it was going to be at a time of their choosing. We hear that phrase so often. Now these early reports about Qatar and the Gulf, probably the more obvious choice, given these are integral to the U.S. operation in the Middle East and have been in the post-9/11 era. Closer to Iran, though, we did imagine that they'd be striking into places like Iraq, with the Ain al-Assad base here, which has been a target for Iraqi militia time and time again, allied to Iran. There are some 40,000 U.S. troops all across this region, some in those bigger bases in the Gulf, but others at much smaller outposts in places places like Iraq and in Syria as well. The United States said earlier this year they wanted to reduce their footprint in Syria, take it down to about 1,000 troops in Syria. I don't think they're there yet. They will not have, most likely, the kinds of defences that a bigger airbase in a place like Qatar will. And people at home may remember in 2020, where Donald Trump ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, head of the Quds force. After he was killed, the Iranians themselves, not their proxies in Iraq, they struck the Ain al-Assad base inside Iraq. And so that was seen as the Iranians hitting directly at the Americans rather than using a proxy. This time round, though, they have fewer proxies at their disposal. Yes, there are still militias in Iraq that still function broadly in the way that they have been before the Hamas attack on October 7th. But other proxies really have been degraded. If you just look at Syria, which sits between the two countries, of course, Bashar al-Assad, really a key ally of the Iranian regime, would help the Iranians move weapons and supplies between Iran and Lebanon, where, of course, the other major proxy existed, Hezbollah. That's still in place, but Hassan Nasrallah, again, has been wiped out by the Israelis in this post-October 7th era, which is extraordinary if you just think about the number of Iranian allies who have been neutralized since that Hamas attack. The knock-on effect of that attack has just been unbelievable. And so the Iranians now do not have a Bashar al-Assad in Syria to rely upon. They do not have as much a Hezbollah empowered in Lebanon to rely upon in order to employ these proxies to hit the Americans. And so they have to do it themselves. We are yet to know the extent of this attack. Look, it's understood that perhaps the Iranians have used up to half of their long-range missile capability. That's the kind of capability they would need to use to strike places in the Gulf. But their rockets, their attack drones, they still have plenty of those in their arsenal, and they're still able to strike at targets closer to home. I'm talking about Iraq, where I am, and in Syria too. So, look, we'll see the extent to which the Iranians really want to strike back. They will want to show their audience at home that they are doing something. By definition, the Iranian regime defines itself in opposition to the great Satan of America, the smaller Satan of Israel, to use their phraseology. So they will have to show a public about whom they are afraid. Let's make no bones about it. There have been massive protests in Iran. They will want to show them that they are doing something. They won't want to do too much, because that would risk their own survival. Diane?
And Ian, how are they trying to ride that line, particularly in their messaging now?
It's had two statements, one from the Iranian Air Force and another, more importantly, from the Secretariat of the Supreme National Security Council. This is a governing body for matters of national security, as the title suggests, but it's also presided over by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, at least in normal times. Let me read you part of this statement. Whoever attacks you, attack him in the same way as he attacked you. In response to America's aggressive action and brazen act, the Islamic Republic of Iran destroyed the U.S. airbase in Al Udeid. Well, that's clearly probably not going to be the case, and we have to wait and see what damage was inflicted on it. But interestingly, they also say the number of missiles used in this quote, successful operation was the same as the number of bombs that the U.S. had used in attacking Iran's nuclear facilities. So, I mean, this is a clear tit for tat. As I said earlier, I was in Iraq when there was retaliation by Iran for the assassination of General Soleimani. That was a calibrated response. And if they fired an equivalent number back, that might also be construed as a calibrated response, but that lies in the hands of the Trump administration. They've already put themselves out there as saying any reaction will be met by an even greater response. As James says, I think it's right. I think the regime has to portray strength domestically. It's under huge amounts of pressure. It's in disarray. Many of its leaders have been killed, and there are questions being raised about how much power they continue to exercise. So it will do that. It will also be succor to their supporters throughout the region. Don't forget, at Friday prayers last Friday, we saw large-scale demonstrations. Tens of thousands of people gathered around the Arab world in support of Iran. And this will also send a message to them, as well as, of course, to Iran's proxies. Just to go on to Iran's capabilities, what Israel is saying is Iran started with something in the region of around 8,000 of these ballistic missiles. Now, it's not saying it's destroyed half of those. What it's saying is it's destroyed half of its capability to launch these missiles. And that is an important distinction. Israeli officials that we've been speaking to also say there is a bottleneck in its ability to fire back. But as James says, certainly places like Qatar are close enough for them to be able to fire like this, as is Iraq and as is Syria.
And Ian, we're now hearing from the Qatari Defense Ministry. They say that the Qatari air defenses successfully intercepted a missile attack targeting Al Udeid Air Base. Again, that is the largest U.S. air base in the Middle East. This news from Qatar comes after Iran had announced that it had launched that attack. I want to bring in our chief foreign affairs anchor, Martha Raddatz. Martha, you've spent a lot of time in this region. What do you make of this announcement now from the Qataris saying that they successfully intercepted this attack, and what does that mean for future retaliation?
Well, I've actually been inside that base there in Qatar, and the command center, the heart of air operations, really the heart of the region for the U.S., that air base. I am frankly not surprised they successfully intercepted the missile attack, because they do have air defenses there in Qatar, in the air base there. And what I've heard from the Iranians is not a surprise at all. They are going to claim, as Ian and James have both said, they are going to claim that the missile attack was successful for their domestic audience. They have been crushed in the last few days by Israel, by the U.S., and they have to, in many ways, save face. And I think that's a real issue, Diane, too. What do they do now? How do they respond going forward? It's exactly right. In 2020, it was a calibrated attack on Iraq. Ian was in Iraq at the time. I was in Iran, reporting there behind enemy lines, essentially, when they launched those missiles toward the airbase in Iraq. And that did leave 100 troops with mild traumatic brain injury. But they didn't follow on with anything. I think one of the reasons they didn't follow on is because they accidentally shot down a Ukrainian commercial airliner, or they might have continued their attacks. But I also think we really have to watch Iran still. They still have capability, and they may have taken out 50% of missile launchers or a good deal of the ballistic missiles, but they still have capability. And if they keep those missiles coming, if they aim for Iraq, if they aim for Bahrain or other bases, they're bound to have some success. And just go back to what President Trump has said in the past. He has very much said that the U.S. would respond with strength. And the U.S. and Donald Trump are certainly in a position where they would have to follow through with that threat as well.
And I want to bring in Colonel Stephen Ganyard into the conversation as well. Colonel, to Martha's point, what is Iran's next move now if Qatar is saying that they were able to intercept this missile attack on this U.S. airbase there?
Yeah, Diane, I think the most interesting thing that I've heard so far is that Khamenei said that the number of rounds that they fired at Al Udeid, and maybe perhaps to other U.S. bases in the region, was limited to the same number of bombs that the U.S. used. So the minimum you could consider would be 14. There were a lot more dropped than that. There were 30 Tomahawk missiles. So we'll see how they count. If they count at 14, when they could be counting somewhere up around 70 or 80, then we'll know that this was clearly just, I have to do this, and I'm going to aim it toward you, or I'm going to lose my credibility here and lose the regime. The other thing that's interesting here is we've watched the videos that are coming out of Doha, Diane, is you'll see a lot of lights in the sky, a lot of missiles in the sky. So both the Patriot and the THAAD, it's a shoot, look, shoot doctrine, and so you'll see 2 Patriots coming up to every inbound missile. So it's not that there are that many inbound missiles; it's that you're seeing the fire doctrine of those THAAD and Patriot batteries is to shoot 2 for every 1 incoming to make sure that they hit that missile. Another point I think that's interesting here, that obviously part of the calculus for Iran was that if they're going to shoot at other countries, even though those are U.S. bases, they are shooting at Qatar. They are declaring war on Qatar. They shoot at UAE or KSA, it's going to be declaring war on those countries. They know that. In a sense, This makes life easier for the United States because before we had to move in lots of naval power because we didn't want to have to ask permission of countries who didn't want to get involved. All those countries are now involved and will probably more than likely to be happy to have U.S. forces very apparent and perhaps even striking Iran from their air bases since Iran has struck them first.
And we can actually see now some of those explosions over the sky in Doha, over that U.S. military base. And now we're hearing that President Trump is meeting with top advisors at the White House as we speak. Rachel, what more can you tell us about those meetings?
Well, Diane, I can tell you that we knew that this was a meeting that was on the president's schedule initially. It was supposed to be happening starting at 1 p.m. here at the White House in the Oval Office. We are now told that this meeting with the president's national security team has now been moved to the Situation Room. I was told by a senior administration official not too long before we came on the air as we were hearing about these strikes that the president and the White House, the Department of Defense, were closely monitoring any threats to any of our troops, including at this air base. So now we are told by a senior defense official
they should
right
be
now
allowed
that Secretary
to
Hegseth, the
retaliate
chairman of the Joint Chiefs Canes,
at
are currently
a
in the
minimum.
Situation Room meeting with the president. And as you can imagine, one of the things that they are going to be mulling over in this moment right now is how the United States is going to respond to this. Yes, they were anticipating some of this because Iran, in the lead up before the president even made a decision on whether or not he wanted to strike, was very forceful in their warnings to the United States, making it clear that strike would be met with strike, that war would be met with war.
I mean,
blow
that's
with
like
blow.
fighting somebody
they warned
that
repeatedly,
you
and
know
the
you can
president,
beat,
after giving the green light,
and then
moving forward with
beating
this
them even
military
more
strike
because they
over the
swung back.
weekend, then put out another warning to Iran, telling them to come to the table, that diplomatic options are still available, that they want to explore diplomacy with Iran. But he did send out that very firm warning saying that future attacks would be far greater and a lot easier. During the Pentagon press briefing over the weekend, we heard directly from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs as well as the Secretary of Defense. They reiterated what the president said in his social media posts and also to the nation, warning of against retaliation to Iran. They said it would be in poor choice, in poor favor. But right now we know the president is still inside this meeting in the Situation Room with his national security team. Diane.
Meanwhile, James, Iran must be considering their next move as well. And it's not just military. One of the big concerns is that they could close the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, that's right. They know full well that if they decide to cause a blockade, to mine it in some way, that could disrupt global trade. Some 20% of the global oil supply passes through the straits there. So they know that that's a big, big move on their part. It probably would affect more the Europeans and Asia than it would the United States necessarily. But Donald Trump was keen about this particular possibility. He was actually messaging today on Truth Social saying everyone should keep oil prices low to play into the hands of the enemy, he said.
Glenn 57.
You know, there's what
that
Iran
makes sense
does,
too.
I
I'm with you
suppose,
on that.
as
Glenn
spectacle,
57.
as theatre, and I would suggest perhaps that shooting missiles at an airbase in Qatar, which it likely knows most of those missiles will get shot out of the air. That's the kind of thing it can sell to its domestic audience. Cutting the Strait of Hormuz, that is real economic pain it can inflict on the world, and that would ratchet up the pressure even more. Likely then to get those European leaders who were trying desperately at the 11th hour to try to get in the room with the Iranians to try to get a deal before Donald Trump ordered that strike on those nuclear sites. Obviously, that didn't go anywhere. I would imagine if the Hormuz Strait was shut, that would get those Europeans back trying to push for a diplomatic solution as quickly as possible. So, look, this is still early days. We don't know if the Iranian attack will stop with Qatar. We've heard speculation that there could be other bases around the region struck. We know that Iran has form hitting bases, for example, in Iraq, where I am now, as I was telling you just a few moments ago. So it's early yet to see what Iran is going to do. Diane?
And we did report last week about aircraft being removed from that airbase as a precaution. So it sounds like the U.S. was prepared for this retaliatory strike, even if it hadn't been intercepted.
Yeah, that's right, Diane. I mean, all U.S. officials knew that this was a possibility that Iran would have to attack. It would have to strike back. As Martha was saying earlier, you know, this is almost a face-saving move that they feel that they have to go through with, of course, a very dangerous one. And last week, as you mentioned, we did report that that base had moved nearly 30 military aircraft They've gone to other bases as this precaution. We also know that they've sent another aircraft carrier into the region, that these aircraft carriers can carry up to 60 fighter jets. All of that to help with any operation that might pop up to respond to these types of attacks, because of course, you know, everybody is very much on edge. They're very nervous because if anything were to get through and if an American were to be killed, you know, the speculation there is that President Trump would have to respond. And that's what has everyone concerned, because, you know, it goes from being this singular limited strike on Iranian nuclear sites, and then it moves into a wider war if there's this retaliation and back and forth and so forth. So, you know, a lot of this, the U.S. officials here say that they are hoping that everything, you know, that this is a one-off, that, you know, they can handle this, they can shoot these missiles down, and that calmer heads prevail. Diane.
Ian, is this response, now that Qatar is saying they intercepted it, still enough to satisfy that need for Iran to retaliate politically for them, or do you think Iranian leadership is still under pressure to do more now?
I think we have to wait and see. Do they attack U.S. bases in Iraq, potentially the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, where, interestingly, the Interior Ministry has advised people to stay indoors, seek shelter? That would certainly be a significant escalation. I think Anne's absolutely right. It depends what the report is on how much damage there is, whether U.S. personnel have been injured. But also a lot of it depends on the mood of President Trump. I think there's many people will feel this was suicidal by Iran. It's already beleaguered. It's had its key leadership killed. It's had its armed forces decimated. Israel now controls the skies. And although this may be face-saving, which shouldn't surprise us because there's form there, the response from the U.S. to this could trigger further events inside Iran. And you've got this real danger now of this going from what felt like a localized conflict into a more regional conflict. And we have to wait and see what the response is, not just of Qatar, but of other Arab countries, especially in the Gulf, and the response of the United States. But there are real dangers here. This really is dangerous ground, that this starts to become far more regional, and that will bring in many players. It will involve the popular mobilization units inside Iraq. It potentially involves Hezbollah, who have also been active again today, and there will be consequences. Now, if the United States and others continue to try and degrade Iran's abilities just from the air, that is one thing. But if anybody is starting to suggest anything more significant, then we're in a totally different ballgame. But again, let's just be patient and wait and see exactly what the impact has been. Let's wait to hear from the President and the Defense Secretary and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. But I would say for Iran and the future of the regime, if it didn't look tenuous already, it certainly does now. Remember, Israel specifically targeted the instruments that are used by the Iranian regime for suppression inside the country, the Basij, which is a kind of domestic security force that's used to enforce Iran's draconian laws, for example, against women, against protesters. They also targeted the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They also dropped a bomb near a prison, an infamous prison inside Iran, used to house political prisoners. And Israel's defense minister has made no bones of the fact that this is about unsettling the regime and its grip on power. And you also had that late-night posting by President Trump when he also raised the question of whether regime change would be bad. And as much as officially U.S. and Israeli officials want to ignore that, it's starting to become a more and more pertinent question.
And Colonel Gainier, how does Qatar go about repelling an attack like this and intercepting these missiles?
Dan, obviously for decades now, the U.S. has been interested in this region and considered Iran a threat. And so all of the Gulf states are tied in with the U.S. in very intricate, very sophisticated air and missile defense systems. So there are radars and links between countries that have radars. And so what we call the air picture over the Persian Gulf is probably covered like no other place in the world. So the ability to share that information, to share inbound missiles that are coming in, to be able to hand those off to various kinds of surface air missile defense capabilities is quite extraordinary. It's like no other place in the world where you have this much information sharing between countries. The missile systems like the THAAD and the Patriot can actually do what we've seen in Israel with some of their systems, and they can actually, as they track the inbound missiles, they can actually calculate where that missile is going to land. And if that missile is going to land, say, outside the fence line in a deserted area outside of Al Udeid Air Base, the system will not go after it. They'll just let it fall harmlessly in an open spot. They only go after, they calculate only those missiles that would hit either a residential area, an industrial area, a military base. Those are the ones they go after. But they have that ability to discern where the impact point is going to be and make a judgment on whether they should intercept that inbound missile.
And again, for anyone just joining us, we are looking at video from just moments ago of an Iranian missile attack on a U.S. airbase in Qatar. The Qataris have said they've intercepted that attack, but we are, of course, waiting to see and hear of any damage there. This is the largest U.S. airbase in all of the Middle East and has played a critical role in so many different conflicts, including Iraq, Afghanistan, strikes on Syria, and so forth. We are now, again, waiting to see the extent of the damage there, if any, but Qatar has said that they have managed to intercept a lot of that attack, if not all of it. And this could still play a critical role in the region. I want to go back to Colonel Steve Ganyard, who's walking us through a little bit about how this attack was intercepted and the protections at play. Actually, let's go to Rachel Scott, who's been following the reaction from the White House now. Rachel, we know the president is in the Situation Room now meeting with top leaders. Given this attack was intercepted, if there isn't a lot or any damage for that matter to the base, how much pressure is on President Trump to respond, or could he let this go?
Well, politically, this puts President Trump in a very tricky position. The president has been very clear, very direct, that any response from Iran will be met with a far greater response from the United States. But remember, President Trump, as a candidate, campaigned on getting the United States out of foreign conflict. He described himself as a peacemaker, even in his inaugural address. And so you have had this split in the Republican Party. And the president, over the last several days, I was told, was getting a series of phone calls from Republicans on Capitol Hill on different ends of this spectrum about whether the United States should get involved. Some, like Senator Lindsey Graham, urging the president for direct U.S. involvement. Others cautioning the president against it, saying that the United States needs to take a step back here and can support Israel as an ally and a friend, but doesn't need to be directly involved. We know the president's calculus on this started to change. Sources tell me that U.S. officials started to realize that Iran maybe wasn't serious about coming to the table for these nuclear talk discussions. I was also told in the last several days by sources that there was this urgent last-minute attempt to try to get Iranian officials and also U.S. officials in one room, and that President Erdogan of Turkey was trying to broker this meeting, speaking with the president directly at the G7 summit. We know that the president then ended his trip to the G7 summit in Canada abruptly. He traveled right back here to the White House, and every day since then he has been meeting with his national security team and his advisors, going over any potential threats to the United States and also the next movements here. But again, the president was very clear about this. In addition to not only warning Iran not to retaliate against the United States, we also heard from the president on social media just yesterday talking about the possibility of regime change. The president saying that it's not politically correct to use that term, but he went on to say that if the Iran supreme leader cannot make Iran great again, why not consider regime change? I had a chance to speak to the White House press secretary earlier today, and I asked her, what did the president exactly mean by that? Is he calling for the United States to get involved to accomplish that? Is he calling for Israel to get involved to accomplish that? Or is he talking about the Iranians? And she was very clear with me that the president was speaking about the Iranian people, saying that it's up to them to decide if they want to rise up to tackle that regime if they don't come to the table for diplomacy, Diane.
Rachel, thank you. Annie, and I want to go back to you because we're now hearing the first reaction from Israel to this attack.
Yeah, that's right. This was a spokesman for the chief spokesman for the Israeli Defense Forces, Effi Defrin, General Effi Defrin. He was asked about Iran's attacks on U.S. bases, saying that we're following developments that are being reported. We are in touch with our partners in the region. And of course, Israel regards this as more proof of the violence, that Iran is a terrorist state that threatens not just Israel, but the region and the world. We're also hearing from Bahraini state television that they have closed their airspace. The Interior Ministry in Bahrain, which of course is home to the US Fifth Fleet, had essentially issued an order advising people to stay at home. Now, no indications that anything has happened there, but it's just worth reiterating that the concerns about what just happened in Qatar are not just felt in that country, but I think throughout the Gulf region. But again, just to be very clear, we need to know whether any of these got through. A US official speaking to ABC News has essentially said that the Qataris and the Americans were involved in the shoot-downs. They're also saying that they don't think any of those projectiles landed in Al Udeid Air Base. Interestingly, Press TV, which is the pro-Iranian or Iranian government television, is claiming that they did land there, but no evidence of that.
And what more are you hearing about the way these missiles were intercepted?
Well, again, this has come from U.S. officials. We know that the Qataris have basically U.S. air defense systems, and of course the U.S. base at Al Udeid has them as well.
And are other assets in the region as protected as this airbase is, or are they more vulnerable?
Well, this is an extraordinarily protected airbase because this is the nerve center, as we've been talking about, for U.S. Central Command. So we know that the attacks on the Iranian nuclear facilities, the flights would have been coordinated out of this base. So it's a very, very critical base. And of course, you know, they don't speak to the security of other bases, but you can guess that this one is probably better protected than others. And that does raise concerns for other spots throughout the region. And we are just hearing, Diane, that there have not been any impacts with this attack in Qatar. We are hearing that they are not tracking casualties at this time. So certainly, I think many people are breathing a sigh of relief because the hope is that this will be contained and will not escalate further. But again, as everybody likes to say, the enemy does have a vote in that. And we don't, you know, we have to wait and see how the Iranians calculate all of this, Diane.
And Rachel, of course, there are lives at stake. There's national security at stake. There's also money at stake here, particularly when it comes to oil and gas prices. How concerned is the White House about that?
Well, it's something that the White House is obviously keeping in mind and folding into their calculus as they're evaluating this ongoing situation and also tensions in the Middle East. But of course, the primary focus from the president and the administration is keeping American lives safe. And so the fact that the target here was our troops, our air base, that could possibly prompt a very sharp response from the president if he decides to move forward. And after warning consistently and repeatedly against retaliation, it does put the ball now in the court of the United States to decide how forceful they want to respond, also possibly knowing that Iran could respond again. And this is the type for tit for tat that many Republican lawmakers and even some Democrats warned about, that warned the president against. Yes, while the president has been adamant that he does not want to see Iran have any nuclear program or nuclear weapon, at the same time there was that campaign promise that he was going to be the mediator, that he was going to be the peacemaker as well. And of course, Diane, I will tell you, all of this comes amid ongoing questions about just how much damage the United States was actually able to do to Iran's nuclear facilities. We heard from the president saying that they were totally and completely obliterated, but we have heard from other members of the administration sort of distancing themselves maybe slightly from that language, maybe not being as strong when they've talked about what actually occurred in that military strike. Diane.
James, what are other bases in this region now doing to try to prepare for possible attacks from Iran?
Well, they've all been told, Diane, essentially to shelter in place. And some of them are very, very simple indeed. A few years ago, I visited one of the smaller bases in northern Syria. Now, there are U.S. forces in Syria and Iraq there as part of the effort to keep ISIS at bay. People will remember ISIS, the caliphate, once it once ruled an area that's governed a huge swathe of northern Syria and Iraq. Together with the United States and the Europeans and others, a coalition pushed those ISIS fighters back, decimated the caliphate, the Kurds on the front foot fighting alongside Arab forces as well. But there remain pockets of ISIS fighters across Syria and Iraq, and they remain, and American troops remain in Syria to try to keep those forces try to keep ISIS at bay, but also advise the local government in both cases in Syria and in Iraq on basically how to police the region. And actually just yesterday there was a suicide attack in Damascus that killed over 20 people, and ISIS, the Syrian government say, claimed responsibility for that attack. So ISIS is still very much a threat, nowhere near the same kind of threat that it used to be, but it remains a serious dynamic in this part of the world. And that is why U.S. forces remain. Now, they are more kind of vulnerable to attacks than other bases, because these are just much smaller locations. We went to one of the bases in the north of Syria, and it was essentially just a large barn in the middle of a field. And yes, there will have been military installations around it, but this is not the kind of large air base that you may have seen pictures of in places like Qatar, or indeed a naval base in Bahrain. These are much smaller. So these U.S. service personnel are essentially much more vulnerable to attack. We actually saw that in January of last year at Tower 22 in Jordan, where U.S. service personnel were killed by Iranian proxies there, and the U.S. had to figure out a response, which was in the end striking their proxies in Syria and in Iraq. So these are much smaller bases around this part of the world. That makes them more vulnerable. They're also much closer proximity to the Iranians. Diane.
Yeah, they're not all as well protected as Al Udeid. James, thank you. And we're getting a look at some of the flight radar over the Middle East right now. Again, many areas in the region are bracing for possible retaliation from Iran. And the Qatari officials actually closed their airspace just shortly before Iran announced this missile attack on the Al Udeid air base. I want to go back to our Ian panel in Tel Aviv. Ian, where does this attack leave us?
Less than an hour from now, President Trump expected to meet with his national security team inside of the White House. That as we learn of new warnings from U.S. sources to Fox of an imminent Iranian strike on a U.S. base in Qatar. In fact, it was the very same base that President Trump spoke at during his trip to the Middle East. Now, this is where the United States has its largest airbase in the Middle East, and Qatar has closed its airspace until further notice. You can look at the flight radar. There are literally no flights above Qatar right now. And the State Department is instructing all Americans to shelter in place. We are learning more about America's historic strike against Iran in the meantime. And new details are emerging about this weekend, how the U.S. carried out a highly precise airstrike mission that successfully took out 3 of Iran's most important nuclear sites. You've heard them by name: Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. And now President Trump is calling for peace.
Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace.
The president hailing the mission on Truth Social, writing, quote, monumental damage was done to all nuclear sites in Iran, as shown by satellite images. Obliteration is an accurate term. And the Pentagon revealing just how unprecedented the mission actually was.
The scope and scale of what occurred last night would take the breath away of almost any American if you had an opportunity to watch it in real time.
This was the largest B-2 operational strike in U.S. history and the second longest B-2 mission ever flown. This operation underscores the unmatched capabilities and global reach of the United States military.
This is Outnumbered. I'm Kayleigh McEnany here with my co-host Emily Campagno and Harris Faulkner. Also joining us, Tudor Dixon, former GOP gubernatorial candidate and host of the Tudor Dixon podcast, and Brian Kilmeade, Fox and Friends co-host, host of the Brian Kilmeade radio show, and host of One Nation with Brian Kilmeade. Well, first, let's go to Chief National Security Correspondent Jennifer Griffin, who joins us live from the Pentagon. Jennifer.
Kaylee, significant intelligence warnings focused on Qatar right now, where the U.S. has its largest air base in the Middle East. Concerns that Iran will fire short or medium-range cruise and ballistic missiles or swarming drones at the U.S. base at Al Udeid. Satellite images show that the U.S. moved most of their unhangared aircraft out of Al Udeid last week, but still this could be a tempting target for Iranian retaliation. Embassies across Doha, the capital, have ordered their workers and their employees evacuated, and for those who remain to shelter in place, the threat appears to be imminent. From a technical standpoint, the military part of this operation on Saturday went flawlessly. 7 B-2 bombers took off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri and traveled east, while another 2 traveled west over the Pacific, serving as a decoy. The B-2s can be seen on takeoff and landing, but were so stealth the Iranian air defenses never saw them. 125 U.S. warplanes were involved in the strike, including F-22 and F-35 escorts, 75 precision-guided weapons fired by the U.S. at Iran's 3 nuclear sites.
The 4th and 5th generation aircraft pushed out in front of the strike package at high altitude and high speed, sweeping in front of the package for enemy fighters and surface-to-air missile threats.
The B-2s took off from Missouri at 12:01 a.m. Saturday morning. 18 hours later, 12 massive ordnance penetrator bunker buster bombs dropped by 6 B-2 bombers on the main enrichment site in Fordo. A 7th B-2 bomber dropped 2 30,000-pound bombs on the underground uranium enrichment site at Natanz. Lastly, 30 Tomahawk missiles fired from an Ohio-class submarine 400 miles away landed at Isfahan. It is much too early to say what the bomb damage assessment at Isfahan, with its hardened tunnels some 600 feet deep, really were. Current and former Pentagon officials think the program was likely set back by 1 to 2 years, but no one knows where the highly enriched uranium actually is. 900 pounds of it, enough for 9 nuclear bombs. It could have been moved or could be buried, we're told. There is little doubt that the U.S. will now face a retaliatory strike from Iran. After the U.S. military killed General Qasem Soleimani in 2020, it took Iran 10 days to fire ballistic missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq, but this time it may come a lot sooner. Kaylee?
Jen, quick question for you, because I'm reading reports about the airspace being closed above Al Udeid Air Base there. Was there any effort to disperse troops ahead of this moment? Because 10,000 U.S. troops is a highly concentrated number of U.S. troops in one place.
We don't have any details, but I can assure you that troops and embassy personnel have been dispersed, and the family members of those troops and embassy members were sent home in the last week. Also, we can report that many of those, we had satellite imagery showing that many of the planes that were at Al Udeid, the U.S. warplanes, they had been moved. You couldn't see them on the tarmac last week. But still a very tempting target, symbolically and otherwise, for the Iranians, and certainly closing the airspace over Qatar. It's clear that other embassies, as well as the Qatar itself, has this same intelligence.
Thank you, Jennifer. You know, Harris, this has happened rapidly. We saw the UK make moves in the US, and now you can look at some of the satellite imagery and you do not see planes over Qatar.
Yeah, I mean, what really flagged me was the shelter in place. So that happened much earlier today. And then you saw the UK get involved in that as well, telling its citizens as well. And that's always a sign that if you didn't get out, and we've heard President Trump in the last few days saying, get on something flying. You know, if you're in that region, and particularly on the ground in Israel, anywhere near there. So many people have taken it up to, and then they've got land bridges going to some of our friends and allies, as well as much as we can lean on them at this point. I mean, Jordan put out a pretty interesting statement that didn't support us, but maybe they just say that publicly, we hope. But in this instance, what's key here is Iran has hit us so many times as military bases around the region. 200 plus times in Biden's presidency, and he did nothing. So they think they've got a bird in the hand by hitting our military people. And as KT McFarland said, and as generals have said on this very air, they need to rethink that after Operation Midnight Hammer.
Yeah, and we know more than 600 troops killed in Iraq at the hands of Iran and their proxies. Brian, you know, the Biden presidency was mentioned, and I do want to put the action President Trump took in historical context. I want to take us back to the late 1990s and show you what Democratic presidents have promised and what President Trump actually did. You can see this here. Clinton, as all of you know, Iran needs to meet its energy needs. And then he goes on to say Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. Obama, I've stated Iran will never be allowed to obtain a nuclear weapon. Biden, we will not, let me say it again, not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. President Trump, the first president who was actually able to stand in front of a camera and say Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. The first three have one thing in common, words. The fourth one has an action.
Yeah, it's such a joke when you see Democrats go, this is a war of choice. We'd have to do that. It's not a threat to us. This is Israel's problem. Since when is it Israel's problem? The other thing is, if they go ahead and hit us in Qatar, keep in mind, there's going to be an immediate response. It's going to be coming right away. We told them in no uncertain terms, if you hit us back, this is it. You hit us back, we're going to wipe out your oil, going to wipe out your gas. Try to get an economy going in Iran if you have neither one of those energy sources. Also, Israel has picked up the pace. They are bombing out paramilitary sites. There are different places, government buildings in Tehran. They also have bombed out the front of Evin prison, where a lot of political prisoners are being held. So believe me, this is not going away. They have lost their command and control. Most of the nuclear scientists. They have an 86-year-old leader hanging out in a bunker somewhere. They should realize, if I could take the president's term, they got very few cards.
Yeah, they do. You have the extraordinary actions of President Trump and the extraordinary actions of our military. Tudor, I want to play this for you. I want to take us back to 2013 to President Obama and the time he mentioned Fordo. Listen to this.
They don't need to have a underground fortified facility like Fordo in order to have a peaceful nuclear program. They certainly don't need a heavy water reactor at Iraq in order to have a peaceful nuclear program. They don't need some of the advanced centrifuges that they currently possess in order to have a limited, peaceful nuclear program.
They didn't need that, but they built Fordo underground, and so it didn't appear that those words worked.
No, and I think that's what all rational military generals have come out and said. Like, we are watching what they're doing. We see that instead of having 3 to 5% uranium enrichment in Iran, they have 60%. We know what that means. That means they are going toward nuclear weapons. This is also a country that has said death to Israel, death to America, time and time again. Barack Obama knew it was dangerous. He wasn't willing to do anything about it because he was scared. Donald Trump has proven nothing. He is afraid of nothing, and he is willing to protect America over anything else.
Yeah, that's right. Emily, I want to focus for a second, and I know you'll do just such a great job at this, on our military. The extraordinary work that they did, the second longest B-2 mission ever to be flown, second only to 9/11, refueling multiple times in air, a stealth mission with diversions. I mean, this shows how extraordinary the U.S. armed forces are, how elite, how incredible in every sense of the word.
I think it can never be overstated, the intensity and the elite caliber of the collaboration and the constellation of perfection required to pull this operation off. And oftentimes when we see a main character who makes it look effortless, we think that they're operating solo. And the reality here is those beautiful B-2 bombers had a support squad, the superheroes of the century. And we heard about the 3rd and 4th gen fighter pilots or fighter jets. So those are the F-22s, the F-35s. These are of history, and the support required, keep in mind, of course, obviously the B-2, its strength is in its stealth, but certainly not in its self-defense maneuverability, agility, or ability to withstand attacks midair. So that's what the squad is for. And when you introduce as well the submarine, right, that shot the Tomahawks over, and you introduce the precision required of the timeliness, of the silence required, I mean, it's an extraordinary feat. And may I just say, as you referenced prior president's comments, the actions here of this president, in the words of the Wall Street Journal editorial board, who said that this president met the moment. I note Jamie Metzel, who was Biden's deputy staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He served on the National Security Council under President Clinton. And he had a lengthy post on Saturday where he said, look, I believe electing Kamala Harris would have been better for our country, goes on. But he said, I also believe Vice President Harris would not have had the courage or fortitude to take such an essential step as the president.
Joining us now, NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube. Courtney, what are the possible parts or paths Iran could take to retaliate, and what American targets does the U.S. military believe are most at risk right now?
So the biggest concern is that they will go after a U.S. military base or asset like a ship in the region. Remember, the U.S. has about 40,000, give or take, men and women, that's in uniform, and civilians throughout the Middle East. And that it includes a number of thousands of them who are out at sea on ships. Now, we have seen Iran retaliate in the past after the killing of Qasem Soleimani. Of course, Iran launching a number of ballistic missiles at a base housing Americans in western Iraq called Al-Assad. But we've also seen these proxy networks also lash out at Americans in recent years, including launching things like rockets or mortars, even drones at some of the smaller U.S. military bases, particularly in Syria, but also in Iraq. That is the biggest concern, is that they will work to somehow overwhelm the existing defenses of some of those bases. But it's not just these little ones that are at risk right now, Anna. There's also defense officials also concerned about some of the bigger bases in the region.
And you also have reporting about a potential threat here at home. Iran sending a private message to President Trump before this attack, warning that they could activate some sleeper cells on American soil. What more are you learning?
Yeah, this happened during the G7 in Canada, an intermediary passing a message from Iran directly to President Trump, warning that if he were to decide for the U.S. military to take action in Iran, that Iran could activate these sleeper cells in the United States and unleash some sort of terrorism here domestically. Now, of course, this was before President Trump decided to very quickly leave the G7 early on Monday, saying that he needed to come back to D.C. because he needed to deal with this evolving and tense situation in the Middle East, particularly in the strikes between Israel and Iran, Anna.
Okay, Courtney Kube, we know you're continuing to dig into the reporting. Thank you so much for bringing us those updates. And now I want to bring in former CIA director and senior national security and intelligence analyst for MSNBC, John Brennan. Director Brennan, Iran has said Americans in the region are all targets. We also have this new warning about Iranian sleeper cells here in the U.S. What are you most concerned about this morning?
Well, I think at this point, Iran is still trying to decide how it's going to respond, because I do believe it feels obliged to respond to the military strikes that we've conducted. And so I don't think they're going to alienate regional neighbors, such as the Gulf states, whether it be Qatar, Saudi Arabia, or the UAE. As Courtney pointed out, the U.S. naval assets in the Gulf, I think, are possible targets because they're taking place on the international waterways of the Persian Gulf. But also, Iran has tremendous capability, if they choose to exercise it, in terms of terrorism. They are the leading state sponsor of terrorism, and they do have assets and sources basically in Europe, Africa, Middle East, Asia, and so on. And whether or not they have sources here in the United States or assets that could be used to carry out these attacks, I think is a question. And I know the FBI, DHS, and state and local officials now are looking very closely at any individuals who may be affiliated with the Iranian regime.
What is Iran's calculation in deciding what levers to pull? And what realistic capabilities do they have, given just how degraded their military is, the number of high-ranking officials who've been killed, the Ayatollah forced into hiding? By all accounts, Iran appears to be in survival mode.
Yes, and certainly their military capabilities have been depleted. They still have missile rocket capabilities that they could, in fact, use in the general area. I think inside of Iraq, there are a number of Iranian militias that continue to operate there and could target U.S. forces. But again, I think they're trying to calculate exactly what they can do that is going to be responsive to the U.S. military strikes, but without triggering even more devastating U.S. military strikes. And it is tough. And I think as General Hertling said earlier, the Iranians, I think, see time being on their side a bit. They don't feel maybe, that it's imperative to strike immediately. They could do some things. They could have some of their proxies reach out now and carry out some strikes against U.S. diplomats or U.S. citizens. But again, I think they're going to be looking at this from the standpoint of what should they be doing over the course of the next several weeks, months, and even years.
It took about 5 days for Iran to launch the response after the killing of Soleimani back in 2020. So that's something for all of our viewers to keep in mind. U.S. officials have concluded, or at least have discussed that they are unsure exactly what happened to those 3 nuclear facilities. We know they put a dent in Iran's enriched uranium stockpiles, according to the officials. But could Iran have moved those stockpiles, or the majority of them? How does the U.S. find out how much uranium Iran still has?
It's going to be tough to decide. I know that there was some movement in terms of vehicles at some of these facilities prior to the strikes, so they could have moved some of that highly enriched uranium outside of it. But I think it is going to be up to a variety of intelligence collection systems, whether it be human sources, technical collection, imagery, and so on. But the IAEA also will be doing some evaluation. So that bomb damage assessment is going to take some time. But I think unless we have people actually inside of these facilities, we're really not going to have a conclusive view of exactly how extensive and how thorough the damage was.
And it's still unclear how far along these programs were. I want to play some sound of what we've heard from the Trump administration about their assessment of Iran's nuclear program and its proximity to developing a nuclear weapon. Let's listen.
The IC continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003.
What intelligence do you have that Iran is building a nuclear weapon? Your intelligence community has said they have no evidence that they are at this point.
Well, then my intelligence community is wrong. Who in the intelligence community said that?
Your director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard.
She's wrong.
What new intelligence does the U.S. have since then that the Iranians have changed their position on nuclear weapons? And does this new intelligence come from U.S. sources and methods, or are we getting this information from other countries?
Well, I would just simply say that the president's made it very clear. He's looked at all of this, all of the intelligence, all of the information, and come to the conclusion that the Iranian nuclear program is a threat.
Just how important is it to nail down this answer? Because right now it's all over the place.
Well, it was, I think, very important to nail it down prior to a U.S. decision to carry out those military strikes. But by all accounts, it's apparent that there is no new intelligence that indicates that the Iranians have moved forward with the nuclear weapons program that was suspended in 2003. And unfortunately, I think this is Bibi Netanyahu and the Israelis that convinced Trump to disregard the position of the U.S. intelligence community and to basically move forward and to try to destroy the nuclear program. But again, no indication at all that there was any imminent threat or that the Iranians were, in fact, moving forward with their plans to fabricate a nuclear warhead.
Do you think we'd be in this position now if the U.S. had not pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal in the first Trump administration?
Absolutely not, because the Fordo was prohibited from enriching uranium until 2030. And so Trump's decision to tear up that agreement and to abandon it, the Iranians were adhering to it. The United States was not. So I think the United States has had a chance to prevent this from happening. But unfortunately, I think the Trump administration has decided that to go forward with Bibi Netanyahu's plans to do as much damage as possible inside of Iran and go toward regime change.
Former CIA Director John Brennan, as always, thank you very much for offering your expertise and your insights.
I've been to Al Udeid in the past before and seen this huge control room where drones, aircraft are monitored and controlled. And it's possible that the attacks against Iran were orchestrated from here. We know that President Trump and the National Security Council are due to meet. They're also acutely aware of these threats. Our colleague Kira Phillips quoting a defense official saying that they don't behave like this unless the threat itself.
Let me bring in MSNBC military analyst, retired Colonel Jack Jacobs. Jack, this was the question. What would Iran consider to retaliate for the massive attack that was launched by and unprecedented attack launched by the U.S. Again, we're getting this from Iranian state TV, but we have 3 new pieces of information that I want to get your reaction to. One is this attack. The second is that sirens are sounding not just at that base, but in Bahrain and Kuwait as well. And you have the president, defense secretary, and other key members of the administration in the Situation Room.
Well, the report, but clearly, if you wanted an off-ramp, to use the old trite expression, and you were Iran, you'd fire a bunch of missiles and be done with it, and hope that that was going to be the end of it. But it doesn't seem like that's the case. One report was that they were headed towards the airbase, our airbase in Qatar, where, by the way, we have 10,000 troops or thereabouts.
Forward position of U.S. Central Command, 10,000 troops.
Correct. A likely target. But if sirens are also being heard in Bahrain and Kuwait, we have naval forces stretch all across the Middle East as well. It may mean that there are other missiles, which means that Iran has decided that it's not necessarily looking for a way to get off of this, get out of this problem, but in fact are raising the stakes. The trouble for Iran is that it's kind of stuck. It's got to do something, it thinks, in order to demonstrate that it's not weak. Don't forget, it's got a domestic audience as well, not the people, but the Republican guards, who in many respects may in fact be lots less progressive even than the mullahs, on the one hand, and the rest of the world also, though it's the domestic audience that they've got to be most concerned about. And second, to make sure that the United States understands that it's capable of responding to preclude further Western attacks. But if it really ups the ante by killing American troops, by sending multiple attacks out there in multiple places that also, by the way, damage people like the Qataris who are acting as intermediaries, then in fact all bets are off. And the likelihood of an American response that the Iranians did not anticipate, something really, really big, becomes greater. Don't forget, the Iranians are looking at the United States and come to the conclusion that the guy who's got his finger on the button is unpredictable. Well, if you're looking at somebody who's an adversary who's unpredictable, what you probably don't want to do is make them angry. And it depends on how long this attack is going to be, how widespread it's going to be, and whether or not it's going to stop after this attack. But if a lot of American troops are hurt, then all bets are off.
There is an Iranian semi-official news agency, Tasnim. They are saying that Iran has launched missile operations, what is called Basharat al-Fath, against U.S. bases in Qatar and Iraq. This basically translates to glad tidings of victory. The operation code phrase is Ya Aba Abdillah, which is a reference to Imam Hussein. So when you talk about messaging and the importance of the domestic audience that the Ayatollah and the people around him are most concerned about, just the name of it will tell you something. But let's consider more specifically the dangers here of escalation, because what the message was from supporters of the president, this was going to potentially just shut it down. This is not shutting it down.
Well, they keep talking about, the administration keeps talking about this being a war against the nuclear capability of Iran. And of course, that's where the attacks were. By the way, as an aside...
Let me stop you for just a second, because Courtney Kuby, who is our reporter at the Pentagon, has gotten in front of a camera now. Talk to us about what we know about these bases. And very importantly, we've heard a lot over the last 36 hours or so about the defenses that are in place. So tell us about that.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the main bases that we're talking about here is Al Udeid. That's in Doha. It's this sprawling, enormous air base that is actually owned by the Qataris, but the U.S. military has been there with thousands of troops operating off that base, largely airmen, for years now. Now, it does have extensive air defense systems in it. That's both ground-based systems, which we've been hearing a lot about in recent days, that have the ability to shoot down not only incoming missiles, but also drones. but they also have multiple fighter squadrons there, fighter jets that have the ability to go up in the air and shoot down incoming as well. We've seen them do that in recent months. U.S. aircraft up shooting down incoming drones, and they can even take down certain missiles, Chris. So that is the defense that they have on the base. It is, as I said, an enormous, sprawling base right in Qatar. But there are other U.S. military installations that also are in the area that are well within the reach of Iran. One is the head of the U.S. Navy in the Middle East, known as Fifth Fleet. It's in Bahrain. There is also there are bases in Iraq as well, multiple bases there that have also come under attack in recent months from Iranian proxy groups, well within, obviously, range of Iran if they were to decide to go after one of those. Remember, Iran has actually targeted U.S. troops and the installation at al-Assad, which is in western Iraq. After the attack on Qasem Soleimani, they retaliated with a number of ballistic missile drones striking that base, causing a number of injuries among U.S. service members, primarily in traumatic brain injuries. Those are three of the main ones that we're looking at. But, Chris, there are a number of other installations there, and we cannot forget we're not just talking about the U.S. military assets that exist on land. There are U.S. Navy ships at sea. They are also well within range. These are the sorts of assets that we're looking at right now. We're aware of the information that's coming across the semi-official Iranian news agencies. But at this point, the defense officials we're speaking to have not been able to substantiate any actual attack beginning. But a U.S. official that I spoke with did say that they were warned about the possibility of an imminent threat against a number of U.S. military bases in the region. That includes some of the ones I spoke with in Qatar, in Iraq, and in Bahrain and elsewhere. Chris?
Thank you so much, Courtney Kube. Come back to us as we get more information. But I want to bring in Brigadier General Mark Kimmett, retired and former Assistant Secretary of State. We just got a statement from Iran's armed forces. I'm going to read you little parts of it, if I can, General. In response to what they call the blatant military aggression of the criminal regime of the United States against the peaceful nuclear facilities of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and in clear violation of international law, Iran has launched a powerful and destructive missile strike on the Al Udeid air base in Qatar. The operation is being carried out under the sacred call. The message to the White House and its allies is clear. It says, Iran will never leave any violation of its territorial integrity, sovereignty, or national security unanswered. We warn the enemies of the Islamic Republic. The era of hit and run is over. The determined will of Iran's powerful and popular armed forces means any repeated provocation will accelerate the collapse of the U.S. military structure in the region. And so what we have is missiles heading for U.S. bases in the region. Your reaction to what we're seeing right now?
Well, I'm glad we probably have some airplanes on scramble alert. Hopefully they're up in the air right now, taking on those ballistic missiles and possibly drones as well. We'll have to wait and see the numbers, the quality, the quantity, because that's going to make a difference. It'll be important to find out if this is just a performative response, which is meant to demonstrate that they are resisting but are really not serious because they don't want to draw the U.S. military into a fight, or if this is the real
U.S. While the world waits for potential Iranian retaliation to U.S. strikes, the conflict could have a major effect on oil and gas prices in the U.S. Right now, oil prices are pretty flat, but that could change quickly if Iran decides to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Let's bring in the head of petroleum analysis at Gas Buddy, Patrick DeHaan, for more on that. Patrick, thanks for joining us. Why do you think these U.S. strikes on Iran haven't led to a surge in oil prices so far?
Well, you know, it's kind of interesting watching the dynamic here because last night in electronic trading, oil prices did jump that 4%, but they've given up all of that gain. And I think the market's very skeptical that Iran is going to be able to even remotely pull off a potential shutdown of the Strait of the Hormuz. In addition, Such a shutdown would also hurt their main client, in this case, China, who received a lot of oil from Iran through the Strait of Hormuz. So it's just incredibly difficult to pull this off. In addition, so many countries rely on this waterway. About 20% of the world's oil flows through this. And so I think there'd be a lot of upset parties that would likely push back and further isolate Iran. So this is a very difficult position to be in for Iran. They don't have a whole lot of good answers. They may talk about potentially shutting it down. That could inspire a jump in the price of oil, but I don't know that they'll be able to pull that off. And I think the oil market is reading into that as well.
President Trump just posted on Truth Social, everyone keep oil prices down. I'm watching. You're playing right into the hands of the enemy. Don't do it. What do you make of that?
It's certainly very interesting that the president would be weighing in on something that's a global commodity here and just kind of essentially saying, well, don't do this. Well, the market is going to do what it's going to do, whether that's lower oil prices or higher. The balance of demand and supply changes when there are attacks in the Middle East, and there's simply no way around it. The risk has elevated of additional attacks. The Middle East is home to many of the largest oil producers in the world. And so the president is essentially asking for the market not to react to the way things have developed. That's virtually impossible. And oil prices will continue to move depending on the actions of what happened in the Middle East. If there's a slight shift in the risk calculus, that could send oil up. If there are de-escalations, that could send oil back lower again.
So how critical is the Strait of Hormuz to global oil prices? And what happens if Iran shuts it down?
Well, it certainly would be vital. I mean, Saudi Arabia, one of the world's largest oil producers, relies heavily on the Strait of Hormuz. So the Saudis would have a very big problem on their hands if Iran were to try and shut this down. Other oil producers as well would have a big challenge. The UAE also relying on the Strait of Hormuz. We're talking about millions of barrels of oil that flow through the Strait of Hormuz every day. And so this would be very problematic, especially for the Saudis. We're talking about 5 to 8 million barrels a day. That would be at stake here. The Saudis do have an alternative that they could send to the Red Sea, but that pipeline is relatively small. So this would be very problematic. But again, oil markets shrugging off the potential that Iran could actually do such a major maneuver. So we'll have to see. But oil markets would be very rattled if Iran does try to make a movement to shut down the Strait of Hormuz.
Up to 50% of China's oil imports come through the Strait of Hormuz, too. So can Iran afford to upset China?
They really can't. I mean, China is really the only large purchaser of Iranian crude oil, which has been heavily sanctioned by many other countries. That's why Iran is now so reliant on China. So to upset China would also inflict even more damage onto Iran's economy. And that's probably why they may only talk about it and they may not even be able to pull this off. So keep an eye. China has been a huge buyer of cheap Iranian crude oil, much of that oil being sold at a massive discount because Iran is heavily sanctioned by much of the Western world.
All right, Patrick DeHaan, we appreciate your time today. Thank you.
All right, let's bring in senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy and author of When China Attacks, Colonel Grant Newsham. Colonel, good morning to you. Thank you for hopping on with us. So China has responded to this already. They've condemned this attack, says it damages Washington's credibility and are concerned that the situation may spiral out of control. So that's what they're saying publicly. But behind closed doors, what conversations are really taking place when it comes to decision making in key areas of interest, including potential aggression towards Taiwan?
Well, what they're looking at is this big change that's happened in the United States. Suddenly you have a president who has some backbone and did what needed to be done for the first time in 45 years when he attacked Iran. The Iranians have been at war with us for 45 years, 46 actually. They've killed some thousands of Americans, injured and maimed a lot more, and nobody ever did anything other than to send them pallets of cash and try to negotiate a deal. And here you had someone that attacked them. So China was looking at Taiwan also and thinking, maybe the Americans aren't that serious. And this has raised some doubts in China's calculus when it comes to Taiwan, when they look at what's just happened in Iran. But of course, we have to see how this plays out, because China has been very happy to have the Americans occupied in the Middle East. That means you can't pay as much attention to the Western Pacific, to Taiwan.
That's a great point on how this could go one way or the other. And before this strike, Colonel, there were reports of Chinese cargo flights nearing Iranian airspace. What do you think that was all about?
Well, it could be. There's always things that we don't know about that happen. They were certainly flying things into Russia at the start of the Ukraine war, and the administration hushed it all up. So that is a possibility. But the bigger issue is that China has been the main backer of Iran for decades. And that includes providing a lot of money, a lot of weapons that the Iranians have given to Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis as well. And now China actually buys 90% of Iran's oil. So that's about 20% of Iran's GDP. And that's the real issue here, is the amount of support that China has given to Iran, and used Iran really as a cat's paw, as a proxy to attack America's friends in the region, to cause chaos. And that, to the Chinese perspective, that works to their advantage. Now we have to wonder, are we going to cut off Iran's oil exports and force the Chinese to go buy oil elsewhere?
Well, that's a great question, Colonel, because yesterday Iran's parliament did approve a plan to close the Strait of Hormuz, which would block $1 billion of oil shipments per day. This is Iranian retaliation, but like you said, this would impact China far more than it would the United States. So here's Secretary of State Marco Rubio yesterday. Watch this.
Do you expect Iran to move to close the Strait of Hormuz to try to disrupt oil transportation across the world?
Well, I encourage the Chinese government in Beijing to call them about that, because they heavily depend on the Straits of Hormuz for their oil. If they do that, it'll be another terrible mistake. It's economic suicide for them if they do it. And we retain options to deal with that.
So does China do that? Do they call Iran and say, do not close the Strait of Hormuz?
They might, or